The city at night was a tapestry of cold, distant lights, a kingdom that belonged to him, Alexander Blackwood, and a prison for me, Amara. From the tinted window of the obscenely luxurious car, I watched the rain streak the glass like tears, each drop a mirror of my own. My reflection was a ghost, a girl in a wedding dress of ivory silk and painful embroidery, a costume for a role I never auditioned for. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," the ghost in the glass whispered. It was supposed to be whispers of love under a harvest moon, a nervous, tender kiss, hands that shook not from fear but from adoration. Not this, not a transaction. My mother's voice, sharp and final as a slamming door, echoed in my memory. "Love is a fantasy for foolish girls, Amara. Alexander Blackwood is a fortress of stability. His wealth will be a roof over our heads, medicine for your father. Your feelings are a price we must pay for survival." She had sold my dreams to settle her debts, and I, the dutiful daughter, had signed the contract with my silence. The car glided to a halt before a monolithic modern mansion, all sharp angles and cold glass. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a corporate headquarters. My new home. He was waiting for me at the top of the stone steps, a silhouette against the grand, illuminated doorway. Alexander, my husband, the man who had spoken less than a dozen words to me throughout the entire ceremony. He was devastatingly handsome, carved from marble and ice, his eyes the color of a winter storm and just as warm. He didn't offer a hand as I ascended, my heels clicking a nervous staccato on the stone. He simply turned and led the way inside, his presence an immense, silent pressure that filled the vast, echoing foyer. "Your rooms are this way," he said, his voice a low baritone that didn't ask but declared. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me all day. Rooms, plural, a sliver of fragile hope, so thin it was almost painful. He led me not to a shared master suite, but to a separate wing of the house. He opened a door to reveal a breathtaking suite, all soft grays, pale blues, and a balcony overlooking the dark, churning sea. It was beautiful and utterly sterile. "This is yours," he stated, his gaze sweeping over me, not with desire but with a kind of detached assessment, as if I were a new piece of art he'd acquired. "I do not require your presence in my quarters. The marriage is a formality. The alliance is sealed. Your family is secure. That is all that matters." And with that he turned and left, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. The sound was a guillotine falling on every terrified, hopeful, confused fantasy I'd secretly harbored about this night. I was his wife in name only, a business acquisition, a virgin bride left untouched, not out of respect, but out of indifference. The tears didn't come then. They were frozen somewhere deep inside, locked in a vault of shame. I was not even desirable enough to be a real wife. I stood in the middle of that magnificent, lonely room, the weight of the diamond necklace on my throat feeling like a chain. I was utterly, completely alone. Days bled into weeks, each one a lesson in isolation. Alexander was a ghost in his own home, a presence felt only in the echo of his footsteps in the hall, the low murmur of his late-night business calls, the lingering scent of his sandalwood cologne in the empty rooms he'd just vacated. We were satellites in the same orbit, never colliding, never touching. I tried to find a purpose. I arranged the flowers that were delivered weekly. I walked the manicured gardens until I knew every hidden pathway. I attempted to chat with the stoic, efficient staff who called me Mrs. Blackwood with a deference that felt like a mockery. The mansion was a gilded cage, and I was its only, lonely occupant. One evening, driven by a restlessness I couldn't name, I wandered into his wing of the house. It was forbidden territory, a line I knew I shouldn't cross. But I was drowning in the silence of my own. I found a study. It was unlike the rest of the house, warmer lived in. Books lined the walls, and on the mahogany desk, amidst a world of cold order, was a single, framed photograph. It was of Alexander, years younger, his face not carved from ice but alive with a devastating, open smile. His arm was wrapped around a woman with laughing eyes and sun-kissed hair. They looked incandescently happy, and tucked into the corner of the frame was a small, faded prayer card, in loving memory of Alara. The date was from 3 years ago. The pieces clicked into place with a sound that was deafening in my soul. His coldness wasn't indifference. It was a fortress. He wasn't withholding himself from me. He was entombed with her. I must have made a sound, a soft intake of breath, because a voice cold as shattering glass came from the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Alexander stood there, his expression not just angry but violently breached. The storm in his eyes was now a hurricane. I was just exploring, I stammered, clutching the frame I hadn't realized I'd picked up. "Put it down," he commanded, his voice dangerously quiet. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his presence overwhelming. He snatched the photograph from my hands, his knuckles white. "This room is off limits. My past is not your concern. You are here to play a part, Amara, nothing more. Do not mistake this arrangement for intimacy." The tears, held back for weeks, finally broke free. They were hot and silent, streaming down my face. "I am your wife asterisk," I whispered, the words choked. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw something other than ice in his gaze, a raw, startled pain. He saw my tears, the utter devastation on my face, the crumbling of my last shred of dignity. "You are a child," he said, but the words lacked their previous venom. They were tired. "A child sold into a gilded cage. Do not cry for a life you never had. This," he gestured between us, "is all it will ever be." He turned and left me there in the heart of his sanctuary, surrounded by the ghost of the woman he truly loved. I sank to the floor, the cold hardwood a brutal contrast to the searing heat of my humiliation. He was right. I was crying for the fairy tale, for the love songs, for the tender wedding night that had been stolen from me not by a monster, but by a ghost. The tension after that night was a living entity, thick and suffocating. He avoided me more pointedly, if that was possible, but a strange shift had begun within me. The innocent, fearful girl was starting to harden, replaced by a woman who understood the bleak reality of her situation. My tears had been shed. Now there was only a hollow ache. A month later, a formal charity gala was held at the mansion. It was my first public appearance as Mrs. Blackwood. I was dressed by stylists, my face painted into a mask of serene elegance. I stood beside Alexander as he greeted the city's elite, his arm a rigid, impersonal bar around my waist. He was the perfect, powerful host. I was his beautiful, silent prop. Until a man older, with a lecherous gleam in his eye and too much whiskey on his breath, cornered me near the balcony. "The new Mrs. Blackwood," he slurred, his gaze crawling over me. "A fresh young thing for the cold billionaire. Tell me, my dear, does he even know what to do with such innocence? Or does he leave you lonely in that big, cold bed?" I recoiled, my mask slipping, a fresh wave of shame washing over me. Before I could form a word, a presence materialized behind me. "Alexander, get away from my wife." The words were not loud, but they carried a lethal, quiet authority that made the man pale instantly. "Alexander, I suggest you leave," Alexander interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "Now." The man scurried away. Alexander turned to me, his hand coming up to my elbow, his touch surprisingly steadying. He led me away from the crowd, onto the deserted balcony overlooking the moonlit sea. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak, trembling from the encounter and the shocking protectiveness he had displayed. He looked out at the water, his profile stark in the moonlight. "I may not be the husband you wanted, Amara, but you are under my protection. No one will disrespect you and remain in my circle." It was the first time he had acknowledged my humanity, my value, beyond being a mere asset. It was a crack in the ice, and through it I saw not a monster but a man. A wounded, lonely man. We returned to the party, but something had changed. Later that night, as the mansion settled back into its profound silence, I heard a soft knock on my door. It was past midnight. My heart leapt into my throat. I opened it to find Alexander standing there, still in his tuxedo, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He held two crystal glasses and a bottle of amber liquid. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice rough. "I thought perhaps you couldn't either." He stepped inside, and for the first time he was in my space, not as an invader but as a guest. We sat on the balcony, the sound of the waves a constant, soothing rhythm. We didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, haltingly, he began to talk. Not about business, not about our arrangement. He talked about Alara. He told me how they met in university, how her laughter could light up a room, how she dreamed of traveling the world. He spoke of the car accident, the phone call that shattered his life, the years of grief that had turned him into the frozen man I had married. The photograph in his study was the last happy memory he had. "I agreed to this marriage," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "because my board insisted on a stable image, and because I thought a woman who wanted my money and nothing else would be safe. She wouldn't expect a heart I no longer possessed." I listened, my own pain receding in the face of his monumental loss. The cold, wealthy man was a myth. Inside was just a boy who had lost his entire world. "I am sorry, Amara," he said, finally turning to look at me. The moonlight caught the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. "For my cruelty, for my indifference. You did not deserve it. You are not a child. You are a woman trapped in a tragedy you had no part in creating." His apology was my undoing. The last of my walls crumbled. "Our wedding night," I began, my voice barely a whisper. He flinched. "I left you in tears, I saw it. I heard you crying after I closed the door. It was the act of a coward. I was afraid, afraid of your youth, your innocence. It was a mirror to everything I had lost." We sat in silence for a long time, two shattered people adrift in the same vast, lonely sea. The first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Good night, Amara," he said, and for the first time my name on his lips didn't sound like a contract. It sounded like a name. That night was the true beginning of our marriage. The forced alliance, the transaction, began its slow, painful metamorphosis into something else. It didn't happen overnight. There were stumbles, moments of retreating back into old habits, but the ice had melted, revealing the fertile, wounded ground beneath. He started eating dinner with me. The conversations were stilted at first, then they became longer, easier. I discovered he had a dry, wicked sense of humor buried under the grief. He learned that I loved poetry and had a hopeless, romantic soul he once would have mocked, but now seemed to find endearing. Months passed. The season turned. One evening, during a walk in the gardens, his hand brushed against mine. It was an accident, but neither of us pulled away. Our fingers intertwined, a simple, profound connection that sent a current of warmth through my entire body. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his stormy eyes searching mine. "Amara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I dared not name. He raised his other hand and cupped my cheek, his thumb gently stroking away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. This was not the touch of a cold businessman. This was the touch of a man seeing a woman for the very first time. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I rose onto my toes and met him halfway. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined in my girlish dreams. It wasn't a frantic, passionate clash. It was slow, tender, and achingly sweet. It was a question and an answer, an apology and a forgiveness, a ending and a beginning. It tasted of salt from our shared tears and the honeyed promise of a future we were only now brave enough to grasp. When we finally parted, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to love you without betraying her memory." "You're not betraying her," I whispered, my heart overflowing with a painful, beautiful hope. "You're honoring her by learning to live again, and I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm just asking you to let me in." That night he did not leave me at my door. He led me to his room, to the bed that had been empty for so long. Our wedding night happened not on the day we were married, but months later in the quiet dark, lit only by the moon and the embers of a rekindled fire. It was not a consummation of a contract. It was a sacrament. He was patient, so incredibly patient, his hands and lips worshiping every inch of me, healing the wounds of our beginning with every tender caress. He whispered my name like a prayer. And when we finally became one, it was not a loss of innocence, but a transformation of it. The tears I shed that night were not of pain or fear or humiliation. They were tears of joy, of acceptance, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of shared pain and had emerged against all odds, pure and strong. As we lay tangled together in the aftermath, his arms a secure fortress around me, I knew. The virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man had found not a jailer, but a soulmate. The man who had left her in tears on their wedding night had just spent this night wiping them away, promising with his every touch, his every whispered word, that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring the only tears she shed from now on would be tears of happiness. And in the warm, safe darkness, wrapped in the arms of my husband, I finally felt like I was home. The dawn that followed was a different creature entirely. It did not arrive as a stark, indifferent light, but as a gentle suffusion of gold, painting the walls of a room I had never truly seen before. Alexander's bedroom was not the minimalist cell I had imagined, but a library of a man's soul. Rich mahogany, shelves lined with well-loved books, a large, worn leather armchair by the fireplace. And in the center, the bed where we now lay, a sanctuary we had built together with trembling hands and whispered truths. I woke to the sensation of his gaze. He was propped on an elbow, watching me, the storm in his eyes quieted to a deep, calm sea. There was no trace of the cold billionaire, no shadow of the grieving widower. There was only a man, humbled and raw, looking at the woman in his arms as if she were the first miracle he had ever witnessed. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep and something else, something wondrous. "Good morning," I whispered back, my heart a frantic, joyful bird in my chest. He didn't look away. He seemed to be memorizing me, the sleep-tousled hair, the line of my shoulder against the sheet, the new, unguarded softness in my eyes. His fingers came up, not with the hesitant touch of before, but with a quiet ownership, tracing the line of my brow, my cheekbone, my lips. "I spent years building walls," he murmured, his thumb stroking my lower lip. "I thought they were made of steel and stone. It turns out they were made of paper and fear. You didn't even have to knock them down, Amara. You just waited, and your silence, your quiet, enduring light made them crumble to dust." His words were a balm, healing the last hidden fractures in my spirit. We rose not as two separate entities orbiting the same space, but as a unit. He made coffee, his large, capable hands looking strangely domestic with the French press. I stood beside him, leaning against the counter, our shoulders brushing. The simple domesticity of it was more intimate than the night we had shared. The change in our dynamic was not a secret to the house. The staff, who had once moved with silent efficiency, now offered small, genuine smiles. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, a woman of few words and a stern demeanor, brought a fresh bouquet of peonies to the breakfast table. "They reminded me of you, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her eyes holding a warmth I'd never seen before. "Full of life and surprisingly resilient." Alexander's schedule, once an immutable law, became flexible. Business trips were shortened. Late nights at the office became a rarity. He started taking me to his favorite places. A small, hidden cove he said he hadn't visited since Ilara, a dusty old bookshop in the city where the owner knew him by name. He was reintroducing himself to his own world, and he was taking me with him. One afternoon, he led me to a part of the gardens I'd never seen, a secluded area walled off by overgrown hedges. He pushed a creaking iron gate open to reveal a forgotten rose garden. The roses were wild, untamed, their petals a riot of crimson and peach against the dark, gnarled branches. This was her project, he said quietly, his hand finding mine. Ilara, she loved the chaos of them. The landscapers wanted to rip them out, make it neat. I couldn't let them. I looked at the untamed beauty, the vibrant life fighting through neglect, and I understood. He wasn't showing me a shrine to a ghost. He was showing me a part of his heart he had kept locked away, a part that was messy and alive and beautiful in its imperfection. "They're perfect," I said, squeezing his hand. "We should bring them back to life together." He turned to me, his eyes shining with an emotion so profound it stole my breath. He didn't say anything. He simply leaned down and kissed me, there amidst the wild, fragrant roses, and it felt like a vow more sacred than any we had taken at the altar. Our life began to weave itself into a new tapestry. Evenings were spent in his study, me reading poetry on the rug by the fire while he worked, his gaze frequently lifting from his papers to find me, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. He started asking for my opinion on his business ventures, not because he needed it, but because he valued it. He was rediscovering his own voice, and he wanted mine to harmonize with it. The physical intimacy between us deepened, evolving from that first, tender night into a language of its own. It was no longer just about passion, but about communication. A touch on the small of my back as he passed me in the hall spoke of possession and pride. The way he would pull me into his lap in the evenings, his face buried in my hair, spoke of a solace he had never known he needed. Our lovemaking was a conversation, sometimes playful and light, sometimes deep and soul-wrenching, a fusion of two broken pieces becoming a stronger, more beautiful whole. Months melted into a year. The anniversary of our arranged wedding day arrived. I woke with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, a ghost of the fear I had felt that first day. But when I opened my eyes, the room was empty. On his pillow lay a single, handwritten note. "Meet me in the foyer at noon. Wear the blue dress. A." The blue dress was the one I'd worn to the charity gala, the night everything had begun to change. At noon, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, I walked down the grand staircase. He was waiting at the bottom, just as he had been on our wedding day. But this time, his stance was open, his expression was soft, and in his hands he held not a prenuptial agreement but a simple, worn leather box. "A year ago I brought you here as a transaction," he said, his voice clear and sure in the vast space. "Today I want to bring you here as my wife." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not a flashy new jewel but a simple, elegant platinum band, engraved with a pattern of wild roses. This was my grandmother. It's the only thing in this house that represents a real, lasting love. I want you to have it, not as a replacement for your wedding ring, but as a promise for the life we are building, for the love I never thought I'd find again. Tears, the happy kind, the healing kind, streamed down my face as he slid the band onto my finger next to my wedding ring. It fit perfectly. "There's more," he said, taking my hand. He led me outside, not to a waiting limousine, but to his own classic convertible, the top down. "We're going on a honeymoon." He drove us out of the city, away from the world of business and obligation, to a small, sun-drenched cottage on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was cozy and bright, filled with light and the sound of waves. There was no staff, no schedule. It was just us. For 2 weeks we were simply Alexander and Amara. We cooked meals together, laughing at our mistakes. We walked for hours on the beach, collecting shells and sharing stories from our childhoods. We made love in the light of the afternoon sun, with the windows open and the sea air washing over us. We talked about the future, not as a business plan but as a shared dream. He spoke of wanting to travel with me, of showing me the world. I spoke of wanting to start a foundation, of using our resources to help girls who, like me, felt they had no choices. On our last night, we built a bonfire on the beach. Wrapped in a thick blanket, Watching the flames dance against the star-strewn sky, I leaned my head against his shoulder. "Do you remember," I began, my voice soft, "what you said to me that first night? That this was all it would ever be?" He was silent for a long moment, his arm tightening around me. "I remember," he said, his voice thick. "They were the most foolish words I have ever spoken." He turned my face towards his, the firelight dancing in his beloved eyes. "This, Amara, you are everything. You are my second chance. You are my life." He kissed me then, and it was a kiss that contained our entire story. The painful beginning, the fragile middle, and the breathtaking, hopeful future that stretched out before us like the endless, starry ocean. We returned to the mansion, but it was no longer a gilded cage. It was our home. The silence was no longer empty but peaceful. The halls no longer echoed with loneliness but with the sounds of our life together. My laughter, his low, rumbling chuckle, the soft music we played in the evenings. The virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man had found a love so deep, so profound, it felt destined. The man who had left her in tears on their wedding night now spent every day ensuring her happiness. And as I stood with him on our balcony, his arms wrapped around me, watching the sun set over the city he once ruled with an iron fist, I knew. Our love story hadn't begun with a ceremony or a contract. It had begun in the quiet, painful space between us, and it had grown, against all odds, into something unbreakable. It was a story of healing, of second chances, and of a love that was truly, deeply, and forever forged in fire. The return from the cottage was not a return to the old life, but the christening of the new. The mansion, once a monument to Alexander's isolation, now seemed to breathe with us. We filled its silence with our new rituals. Mornings were no longer solitary affairs. They were a shared pot of coffee at the sun-drenched kitchen island, our feet tangled together under the counter, the morning news a soft backdrop to our quiet plans for the day. He began to involve me in his world not as a formality, but as a partner. One evening, he spread architectural blueprints across his massive desk, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "The Blackwood Foundation headquarters," he said, his finger tracing the lines of a stunning, modern glass structure. "It's been a concept for years, but it never felt right. It felt like a tax write-off, a plaque on a wall." He looked at me, his stormy eyes earnest. "You spoke about helping girls with no choices. I want this to be that, our project, yours and mine. I'll handle the business, the infrastructure. You will be its heart." Tears pricked my eyes. He wasn't just giving me a charity to run. He was handing me the keys to my own purpose, built on the foundation of my deepest passion. We spent hours that night, heads bent over the plans, my ideas flowing, his business acumen shaping them into reality. He listened, truly listened, his gaze full of a pride that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with respect. This new intimacy bred a new kind of vulnerability. One night, a sudden summer storm rattled the windows of our bedroom. A violent crack of thunder shook the house, and I felt Alexander jolt awake beside me, his body going rigid. A low, pained sound escaped him, a sound I had never heard before, pure, unvarnished terror. "Alexander," I whispered, turning to him in the dark. He was breathing in sharp, ragged gasps, his eyes wide and unseeing. "The rain, the skid," he choked out. It was the accident, the ghost of Alara summoned by the storm. Without a word, I wrapped my arms around him, pulling his head to my chest, holding him as the tremors racked his powerful frame. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I didn't tell him it was okay. I just held him, my hands stroking his back, my voice a soft, steady murmur against his hair, anchoring him in the present, in the safety of my arms. When the storm passed and his breathing evened out, he was quiet for a long time, his face still buried in my neck. "No one has ever," he began, his voice rough with shame and something else, awe. "I've always been alone in that. I never let anyone see." "You don't have to be alone in anything anymore," I whispered, kissing his temple. "Not in your joy and not in your pain. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." It was a pivotal moment. In allowing me to see his broken pieces, he made us whole. The last vestige of the untouchable billionaire vanished, replaced by a man who trusted me with his deepest scars. Our life became a beautiful, ordinary miracle. We had silly arguments about what to watch on television. He developed a hopeless addiction to the terrible reality shows I loved, pretending to hate them while being fully invested in the drama. I learned to play chess, and to my delight, I beat him one rainy afternoon, the triumph on my face making him laugh, a real, full-bodied, joyous sound that echoed through the house. The wild rose garden became our shared sanctuary. We spent weekends there, our hands dirty, reviving Alara's legacy. It was no longer a monument to a past love, but a testament to how love can grow in the most unexpected soil. We were not erasing her. We were weaving her memory into the new tapestry of our lives, acknowledging that the past had shaped the man I loved, but it did not define our future. One evening, as we sat on our bench amidst the blooming roses, the setting sun casting everything in a warm, honeyed glow, he took both my hands in his. "Amara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given me back a life I thought was lost forever. You saw the man behind the fortress and you were not afraid. You taught me that a heart can break and yet still have room to love again, even more deeply than before." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. From it, he tipped not a ring but a simple, old key into his palm. "This is the key to the cottage," he said, closing my fingers around it. "Our place. I've bought it. It's ours. Forever. A promise that no matter how big our lives get, we will always have a place to just be us." I looked from the key in my hand to the face of the man I loved, a man who had been forged in loss and hardened by grief, but who had chosen to soften, to open, to love me with a ferocity and tenderness that still left me breathless. The cold, forced marriage had become the greatest love story I could ever have imagined. I leaned forward and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss that held the weight of our entire journey. "I love you, Alexander Blackwood," I whispered against his lips. He smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached his eyes, banishing the last of the winter storms. "And I love you, Amara Blackwood, my wife, my miracle." As the stars began to pepper the twilight sky, wrapped in the scent of roses and the sound of the distant sea, I knew our story was far from over. It was only just beginning, and every chapter to come would be written not out of duty or force, but from a love that had been earned, fought for, and cherished. A love that had turned a transaction into a destiny, and a house into a home. The purchase of the cottage was more than a romantic gesture. It was a foundation stone for our future. It became our true north, the place we escaped to whenever the world of Blackwood Industries threatened to become too consuming. There, Alexander was not a billionaire CEO, and I was not the poised Mrs. Blackwood. We were simply a man and a woman, learning the contours of each other's souls. It was at the cottage, a few months later, that I first felt the subtle shift within my own body. A strange, fluttering nausea in the mornings, a profound fatigue that would descend in the afternoon, and a new, almost painful tenderness in my breasts. At first, I dismissed it as the stress of launching the foundation, which was now rapidly taking shape. But when the scent of Alexander's morning coffee, once a comforting ritual, sent me rushing to the bathroom, a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating hope began to bloom. I said nothing. I needed to be sure. On a pretext of needing some art supplies from the village, I drove to the local chemist, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I bought the test, a simple plastic stick that held the power to redefine our universe. Back at the cottage, with Alexander down at the cove sketching the waves, I locked the bathroom door. The wait for the result was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The girl who had arrived at the mansion in a veil of tears was gone. In her place was a woman, her eyes wiser, her mouth softer, her face etched with the profound happiness of a love deeply known. When I looked down, the two bold pink lines stared back at me. A sob caught in my throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. I clutched the edge of the sink, my knees weak. A child, our child, a living, breathing testament to the love that had risen from the ashes of our painful beginning. I had to tell him, but how? This wasn't just news, it was the culmination of our entire journey. I needed it to be perfect. I hid the test and spent the rest of the day in a blissful, nervous daze watching him, my secret glowing inside me like a sun. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, a plan formed. I waited until he was relaxed, his sketchbook in his lap, a glass of wine in his hand. I took a deep breath. "Alexander," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "do you remember what you said to me in the rose garden? That I taught you a heart can break and still have room to love again?" He looked up, his expression immediately softening, attuned to every nuance of my voice. "Of course I remember. Every word." I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling out a volume of poetry he'd given me. Tucked inside was the ultrasound picture I had secretly obtained that afternoon in the village. I walked back to him and knelt before his chair, placing the grainy, black and white image on top of his sketchbook. "My love," I whispered, my eyes filling with tears of joy. "It seems our hearts have made even more room, enough for three." He stared at the picture. The world stopped. The crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind outside, it all faded into an immense, breathless silence. His face went pale, his eyes wide and disbelieving. He looked from the ultrasound to my face, then back again, his powerful hands trembling as he picked up the slip of paper. A baby," he finally rasped, the words barely audible. I nodded, a tear slipping down my cheek. "Our baby." The sound that broke from him was a raw, shattered sob of pure, unbridled joy. He dropped the picture and surged forward, falling to his knees on the rug and pulling me into his arms so tightly I could barely breathe. He was shaking, burying his face in my neck, his own tears hot against my skin. "A baby," he choked out over and over. "Amara, my God, a baby." He pulled back, his hands cradling my face, his eyes, brilliant and wet, searching mine. The storm in them was gone, replaced by an awe so profound it was humbling. He looked at me as if I had just handed him the entire world. This is everything," he whispered, his thumb stroking my cheek. "You are everything." He lowered his head and pressed a long, reverent kiss to my stomach, a silent vow to the tiny life growing within. Then he rose, lifting me effortlessly into his arms and spun me around in the middle of our cottage, laughing through his tears, a sound of pure, liberated happiness. The months that followed were a season of golden light. Alexander became my shadow, my protector, my most devoted attendant. His cool boardroom demeanor melted away at home, replaced by a comical, endearing anxiety. He researched prenatal nutrition, filled the house with every pregnancy pillow imaginable, and would talk to my growing belly every night, his deep voice a soft rumble telling stories of the sea and the stars, of the mother he adored so much. The shadow of the past was not forgotten, but it was finally integrated. One day he took my hand and said, "I want to tell our child about Alara, not as a tragedy but as a part of the story that led us here. She would have loved you, Amara. She would have been so happy that I found my way back to life." The launch of the Blackwood Foundation for Young Women was a triumph, but it was a secondary joy compared to the life blossoming within me. My mother, who had once sold my future, visited. She saw the way Alexander looked at me, not with cold ownership but with worship, and the way I commanded the room, no longer a frightened girl but a woman radiant with purpose and love. There were no grand apologies, but in her eyes I saw a dawning, humbled understanding. She had been wrong. Happiness could not be bought. It had to be built, and we had built a palace. The night I went into labor, Alexander was a model of calm strength on the surface, but I saw the panic in his eyes, the way his hand trembled as he held mine. He never left my side, his voice a constant, steady anchor in the storm of pain and effort. And when our daughter finally entered the world with a fierce, indignant cry, The universe shifted on its axis. The nurse placed the tiny, swaddled bundle in his arms. He looked down, and I watched as a lifetime of icy defenses, of grief, of lonely fortresses, crumbled into dust. A single tear traced a path down his cheek and fell onto our daughter's forehead, a baptism of pure, unadulterated love. He looked at me, his face transformed by a joy so complete it was almost painful to behold. "Amara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion, "look what we made." He brought her to me, laying her gently in my arms. She was perfect. A shock of dark hair, his stormy eyes, and a tiny, rosebud mouth. "Elara," I whispered, looking up at him. He nodded, his eyes overflowing. "Elara Hope," he said, his voice firm. "For the past we honor and the future we now hold in our arms." We brought our daughter home to the mansion, but it was no longer just a house of stone and glass. It was filled with light, with the soft scent of baby powder, with the lullabies I sang, and with Alexander's deep, rumbling voice reading financial reports to his captivated audience of one. I stood at our balcony one evening, our daughter sleeping on my shoulder, and felt Alexander come up behind me, his arms encircling us both. He rested his chin on my head, and we looked out at the city lights, now softened by the haze of a gentle rain. "Do you remember," I said softly, "the first night I came here, the rain felt so cold." He held us tighter, his lips against my hair. "I remember. And now," he whispered, his voice full of wonder as he looked down at our daughter's sleeping face, "now the rain just washes the world clean for her." The virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man had found not just love, but a family. The man who had left her in tears now spent his days ensuring that his wife and daughter knew only joy. Our story had begun in tears of sorrow, but it had woven itself into a tapestry of tears of joy, of lullabies, of whispered love in the dark, and of the profound, unshakable peace that comes when a transaction, against all odds, becomes a destiny. And as I leaned back into the strength of my husband, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back and the soft breath of our daughter on my neck, I knew with absolute certainty that our greatest adventure was only just beginning. The cry that pierced the stillness of our bedroom was not one of infant hunger or fleeting discomfort. It was a sound of pure, primal terror, ripped from the depths of my husband's soul. I jolted awake, my heart slamming against my ribs, the residual warmth of our peaceful evening vanishing into a chilling dread. Alexander was not beside me. The sound came again, a raw, shattered sob from the direction of the nursery. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold floor, my blood running cold. Pushing the door open, the nightlight cast a soft glow on a scene that shattered me. Alexander was on his knees beside the crib, his powerful shoulders heaving, his face a mask of utter devastation. He was trembling violently, his hands gripping the crib's railing as if it were the only thing holding him to the earth. In the crib, our daughter, Elara, slept peacefully, utterly unaware of the storm raging beside her. "Alexander," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't seem to hear me. His gaze was locked on her, but he was seeing something else entirely. "I heard the skid, the glass," he choked out, the words fragmented, torn from a nightmare. "I couldn't get to her, I couldn't save her." It was the accident. The ghost of his first love had returned, not for him, but for our child. The protective father, the man who had built a new world with me, had been ambushed by the oldest, deepest wound he possessed. I didn't hesitate. I crossed the room and knelt beside him, wrapping my arms around his shaking form. I didn't tell him it was a dream. I didn't tell him he was safe. I simply held him, anchoring him with my presence, my body a barrier between his past and our present. "It's Amara," I said, my voice firm and steady, a lighthouse in his personal hurricane. "I'm here. Elara is here. She's safe. She's breathing. Listen to her breathing, Alexander." I guided his hand, which was clenched white-knuckled on the railing, and placed it gently on our daughter's tiny back. He flinched at the contact, as if burned, but then he felt it. The the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of her slumber. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. The tension in his arm slowly eased. He kept his hand there, feeling the living proof of her safety, her existence. "I saw her in the car seat," he whispered, his voice broken. "It was Alara, but it was our Alara." "I know," I murmured, holding him tighter. "But she's here, with us. You saved her every day by choosing to live, by choosing to love me, by creating this family. You didn't fail anyone, Alexander. You built this." He turned his head, his tear-streaked face burying itself in my shoulder. He clung to me, and for a long time we stayed like that on the nursery floor. A king brought to his knees by love and fear, and the queen who refused to let him fall alone. When his breathing finally steadied, he pulled back, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. He looked at our sleeping daughter, then at me, his expression one of raw, humbled awe. "The fear," he began, his voice hoarse. "It's paralyzing to love something this much." "I know," I said softly, reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek. "But we'll be paralyzed together. We'll face every fear, every nightmare together." He nodded, a new resolve settling in his gaze. He leaned forward and pressed a long, tender kiss to Alara's head, a silent renewal of his vow. Then he stood, pulling me up with him, his arm a solid, secure weight around my shoulders. He didn't go back to our bed. Instead, he led me to the large armchair in the corner of the nursery. He sat and pulled me onto his lap, wrapping us both in the soft blanket that was draped there. We stayed there for the rest of the night, watching our daughter sleep. He didn't sleep, and neither did I. We were standing guard, not just over her, but over the fragile, beautiful world we had built. The dawn that broke was the most profound we had ever witnessed. It didn't just signal a new day, it signaled a victory. The ghosts of the past had made one final, desperate assault, and they had lost. Our love, our family, had held the line. As the first rays of sun painted Alara's face in a golden light, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw her father holding her mother, and a tiny, gummy smile spread across her face. Alexander looked down at her, and the last vestige of the storm in his eyes cleared, replaced by a peace so deep it was palpable. "Good morning, my love," he whispered to her, his voice thick with emotion. Then he looked at me, his eyes saying everything his words could not. The journey had been longer and harder than either of us could have imagined. It had begun with a forced marriage, a cold groom, and a bride left in tears. It had wound through pain and misunderstanding, through grief and healing, through the terrifying vulnerability of new love and the earth-shattering joy of new life. It had led us here, to a nursery bathed in morning light, to a love that had been tested by the worst of his past and had emerged, not just unbroken, but unbreakable. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss of promise, of gratitude, of a future that was no longer haunted, but blessed. Our story was complete, not because it was over, but because the final piece had fallen into place. We were no longer just a husband and wife. We were a fortress, a sanctuary, a family, and we were, finally and forever, home. The morning after the storm in the nursery, a new quiet settled over the mansion. It was not the silence of old, heavy with loneliness, but a profound, peaceful hush, as if the very walls were exhaling in relief. Alexander moved with a new kind of gravity, his touches to Alara more deliberate, his gaze on me longer, deeper, as if he was rememorizing the contours of his salvation. The haunting had been real, but the exorcism was complete. In its place was a love that felt seasoned, tempered like steel. We had looked into the abyss of his oldest fear together, and we had not blinked. Life did not simply resume, it ascended. The Blackwood Foundation for Young Women opened its doors in a stunning glass and steel building that reflected the sky. At the opening gala, I stood at the podium, my voice clear and strong, no longer the silent, terrified prop from a year ago. I spoke of second chances, of finding your voice, of building a future from the broken pieces of the past. Alexander stood in the front row, his eyes fixed on me, his pride a tangible force. He was not the story anymore. He was the foundation upon which my story could be built, and I was his. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but the only sound I heard was the soft, sure whisper of his heart, a rhythm that had become my own. Later that night in our bed, with Alara sleeping soundly in the adjoining room, he traced the line of my collarbone. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You owned that room. You owned your story." "It's our story," I corrected softly, turning to face him. "Every chapter." He smiled, a slow, deep smile that still had the power to make my breath catch. "Then let's write a new one," he murmured, his lips finding mine. The months folded into a year, then two. Elara grew from a tiny, swaddled bundle into a whirlwind of dark curls in her father's stormy, curious eyes. She had his determination, and I was told, my stubborn hope. The wild rose garden was her kingdom. We would spend hours there, Alexander pushing her on a swing he'd hung from the old oak tree, her laughter ringing out, a sound so pure it felt like it could heal any old wound. It was on her third birthday, amidst the chaos of balloons and tiny, frosting-smeared faces, that I felt a familiar, fluttering sensation deep within me, a dizzying sense of déjà vu. I said nothing, waiting, holding the secret close like a precious, fragile gift. This time the telling was different. There was no fear, no trembling uncertainty. A few days later, I led him back to the rose garden at dusk. The air was heavy with their perfume. "Do you remember," I began, taking his hand, "when I knelt before you in this very garden and showed you our future?" He looked down at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It was the moment my life truly began. I smiled, a slow, secret smile. "Well," I said, placing his large, warm hand flat against my stomach, "it seems our future is expanding." His breath hitched. The look on his face was not the shattered, joyous shock of the first time, but something deeper, more profound. A quiet, overwhelming completion. He pulled me into his arms, not with frantic energy, but with a slow, reverent certainty, as if he was welcoming home a part of himself he'd always known was missing. "Another miracle," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my miracle worker, Amara Blackwood." The pregnancy was a season of golden contentment. Alexander was an old hand now, his anxiety replaced by a confident, joyful anticipation. He would talk to my swelling belly, telling stories to his son, for the ultrasound had revealed a boy, with Alara listening intently, her small hand often resting beside his. "This is your brother," he would tell her solemnly. "We must teach him about the roses and the sea and how to be very, very brave like your mother." Our son Leo was born on a calm, clear morning, his entry into the world as peaceful as his sister's had been dramatic. He had my fair hair and a serene, observant nature. When Alexander held him for the first time, he looked from our son's quiet face to our daughter's vibrant one, and then to me. In that look was the entire universe, past, present, and future, finally, perfectly aligned. That evening, as I rested in our bed with Leo sleeping in my arms, Alexander brought Alara in to meet her brother. She climbed onto the bed with immense gravity, peering at the tiny bundle. "He's small," she declared. "He is," Alexander said, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on my leg. "But he has your mother's strength, and your curiosity." Alara considered this, then leaned forward and pressed a soft, messy kiss on Leo's forehead. "I'll teach him," she said, with all the authority of a 3-year-old queen. Alexander and I exchanged a look over their heads, a silent conversation of shared, immeasurable joy. This was the legacy. Not the billions, not the corporate empire, not the foundation, though they were all part of it. This was the true legacy. This room, this love, this unbreakable chain of healing and hope we had forged. Years later, on our 10th anniversary, we stood on the balcony of our cottage, the same place he had given me the key. The sea was a sheet of hammered silver under the moonlight. Our children were asleep inside, the sounds of their breathing the sweetest music we knew. Alexander stood behind me, his arms wrapped around me, his chin resting on my head. We had lived a lifetime in a decade. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked softly, leaning back against his solid warmth. "That first night, the car ride in the rain." He was silent for a long moment. "I think of it every day," he said, his voice low and sure, not with regret but with a kind of reverence, "for the path that led me to you, for the tears you shed that watered the seeds of this." He tightened his arms around me. "I would live every second of the pain again, Amara, if I knew it would lead me to this exact moment, to you, to them." I turned in his arms and looked up at the man I loved, the cold, wealthy stranger who had become my husband, my partner, the father of my children, my best friend. The man who had taught me that love isn't always a gentle beginning. Sometimes it's a painful, fractured one that, with patience and courage, fuses together into something stronger and more beautiful than either piece could ever have been alone. I kissed him, a slow, deep kiss that held the weight and wonder of our entire story. The virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man had found a love that was an ocean, deep and endless. The man who had left her in tears now spent his life ensuring that her every smile was his greatest accomplishment. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. And it was far, far from over. The cottage, once a secret haven, had become the vibrant, noisy heart of our world. Its walls, once echoing with our tentative new love, now absorbed the shrieks of children's laughter, the thud of small feet running across wooden floors, and the soft, tired sighs of profound contentment at the end of a long day. Leo, at 5, was a quiet force of nature, with a scientist's curiosity for the tidal pools on the cove and a deep, intuitive gentleness he reserved for his older sister. Ilara, at 8, was a whirlwind, all fierce opinions, dramatic pronouncements, and a protective love for her brother that mirrored the way her father watched over me. It was here, surrounded by the chaos and joy we had created, that the final ghost was laid to rest. We were celebrating Ilara's birthday. The cottage was a riot of color and noise, filled with her school friends. Alexander, who could command a boardroom of hardened executives with a single look, was utterly at the mercy of a pack of 8-year-olds, patiently teaching them how to fly the intricate kite he'd bought for the occasion. I watched from the porch, Leo leaning against my side, as Alexander ran across the grass, the kite soaring behind him, a brilliant splash of color against the blue sky. Ilara ran beside him, her hand in his, her face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. And in that moment I saw it. The last shadow, the final, almost invisible shard of ice in his soul, simply melted. It didn't vanish in a dramatic catharsis, but dissolved in the simple, overwhelming sunlight of his daughter's happiness. He wasn't just going through the motions of being a father. He was fully, completely present. The man who had been afraid to love was now flying a kite with abandon, his laughter ringing out, free and unburdened. Later, after the cake had been devoured and the last guest had been driven home, we put 2 exhausted, sandy children to bed. We collapsed onto the porch swing, the silence a comfortable blanket around us. The only sounds were the crickets and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the sea. He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. He didn't speak for a long time, just looked out at the star-dusted horizon. "She would be so happy," he said, his voice quiet and sure. I didn't need to ask who. I simply squeezed his hand. "I used to think that loving you, loving them, was a betrayal of her memory," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the distance. "That I was replacing her. But today, watching Ilara, I realized it's the opposite. This joy, this noise, this life, it's the monument she would have wanted. It's the life she was robbed of. By living it, by loving you so completely, I'm not erasing her. I'm finishing the song she never got to sing." Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of a deep, reverent understanding. This was the final piece of his healing, not forgetting but integrating, not moving on but carrying forward. "She's a part of this, Alexander," I whispered. "Her name is in our daughter's laugh. Her love of wild things is in our rose garden. She is woven into the very fabric of our family." He turned to me then, and in the moonlight, his face was softer than I had ever seen it. The last of the winter had finally, truly, given way to an eternal spring. "Thank you," he said, the words simple and devastatingly profound. "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for teaching a frozen man how to feel the sun." He leaned in and kissed me, and it tasted of sea salt, of birthday cake, of forgiveness, and of a future so bright it was blinding. The next chapter of our lives was not about dramatic transformations, but about the quiet, solid joy of building. The Blackwood Foundation thrived, becoming a powerful voice for change. Alexander, no longer driven by a cold ambition to forget, but by a warm desire to build a better world for our children, became a different kind of businessman, a philanthropist, a patron, a force for good. Our name, once synonymous with cold wealth, became associated with hope. The children grew. Ilara, with her father's sharp mind and a fiery passion for justice that was all her own. Leo, with his quiet intensity, his love for stories and the natural world. Our dinner table was a loud, chaotic, wonderful place of debate, of shared stories, of plans and dreams. Years later, we stood on the same balcony of the mansion where our story had begun. Below us, the city glittered, a kingdom he had once ruled from a place of isolation. Now, it was just a beautiful view from the home we had built together. My hair was streaked with silver, his temples were gray, but his hand in mine was as strong as ever. Ilara was away at university, studying law. Leo was in his final year of school, dreaming of being a marine biologist. The house was quieter, but the silence was different now. It was a peaceful, earned silence, filled with the echoes of a life well lived. "It's strange," I mused, leaning my head against his shoulder. "I barely remember the girl who was driven here in the rain. She feels like a character from a book I read long ago." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it. "I remember her," he said softly. "I remember her courage. I remember the light in her eyes, even through the fear. I will be forever grateful to that girl for being brave enough to step into the lion's den, for having the faith to see the man behind the beast." He turned me to face him, his eyes, still the color of a winter storm, but now warm with the hearth fire of a love that had burned for decades. "The story they told," he said, a small, knowing smile on his lips, "was of a virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man. They got the beginning right, but they never could have imagined the middle or the end." He cupped my face, his thumb stroking my cheek with a familiarity that was as natural as breathing. "The cold man learned to love. The forced marriage became the greatest choice I never knew I was making, and the wedding night that left her in tears was simply the first, painful contraction before the birth of a joy so immense. It has filled every moment of my life since." He kissed me then, not with the desperate passion of our youth, but with the deep, steady, unwavering love of a man who had come home and found his home was a person, and that person had built a world around him. Our story was complete. It had all been there in that first terrible night. The pain, the fear, the tears, they were the seeds, and with time, with patience, and with a courage we found in each other, they had grown into this. A life, a love, a legacy. And as the lights of the city twinkled below, I knew with absolute certainty that the greatest love stories aren't the ones that are easy from the start. They are the ones that are forged in fire, tempered by tears and made unbreakable by the choice, every single day, to love again. Our story was that. It was ours. And it was, and would always be, enough. The leather of the journal was soft and supple under my fingertips, worn from years of being held, written in, closed, and contemplated. It was more than a book. It was a sacred text, the gospel of Alexander's heart. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a warm, pulsing glow over the cottage living room where we lay nestled in a fortress of blankets and pillows. The first hint of dawn was a pale, silvery line at the edge of the world, but I was still lost in the world of his words, a world that had existed parallel to my own for all these years. I turned another page, my breath catching. The entry was dated just a few months after Leo's birth. I watched her today, sleeping with our son in the crook of her arm. The sunlight was on her face, and there was a smudge of fatigue under her eyes, and I have never seen anything more beautiful in my entire life. It is a terrifying thing, this love. It is an ocean, and I am drowning in it willingly. Before her, I built my life on the principle of control. Now I am learning to surrender to the current. She is the current. Leo's tiny hand, curled around her finger, is my anchor. How is it that a man can be so unmoored and so grounded at the same time? I look at them, and I understand the word holy. Tears blurred the careful, precise script. I had been so consumed in those early days of motherhood with the sheer physicality of it, the sleepless nights, the constant demand, the feeling of my body no longer being entirely my own. I had seen his support, felt his strength, but I had never glimpsed this quiet, internal revolution. He wasn't just helping me. He was undergoing a spiritual awakening of his own. I read on through the years, an entry from Alara's first day of school. I stood at the window and watched Amara walk Alara to the car. Our daughter, so small, her backpack almost as big as she is, her hand trustingly tucked in her mother. Amara knelt, straightened her little dress, kissed her forehead. A simple, everyday miracle. And I felt a pain so sharp it was almost physical, the pain of time passing, of this fleeting, perfect moment. I wanted to freeze it, to keep them both exactly as they were, safe in the bubble of our home. But life is motion. Amara taught me that. To resist motion is to resist life itself. So I let them go, my heart cracking and expanding in the same breath. There were darker entries, too, pages where the ghost of his old despair would visit. A nightmare again, the rain, the screech of tires, but this time it was Amara's face I saw. I woke in a cold sweat, my hand reaching for her, needing to feel the solid, living reality of her. The fear is different now. It's not the fear of losing a memory, it's the terror of losing my future. She has become my future. The thought of a world without her light is a world plunged into eternal night. I will not survive it. This is the burden and the blessing of this second love. It carries the weight of all my capacity for loss. I had to stop reading then, pressing the heel of my hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. I had known his nightmares, had held him through them, but I never knew the specific terror that fueled them now. It wasn't just about the past. It was a dread of a future without me. The responsibility of that was immense, but so was the honor. To be so essential to another human being's existence was the most profound contract of my life. The final entries were more recent. One, from just a few weeks ago, made my heart stop. We are approaching 20 years, 2 decades. It feels both like a single breath and an entire lifetime. I look at her sometimes when she doesn't know I'm watching, when she's reading to Leo, or laughing with Alara on the phone, or frowning in concentration over a foundation proposal. The girl is still there, in the determined set of her jaw, in the hope that still lights her eyes. But she is also so much more. She is a queen, a general, a saint. She is my wife. And I am still, every day, humbled that she is mine. I do not know what I did to deserve this second chance, but I will spend every remaining second of my life earning it. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the cottage with a clean, new light. I closed the journal, holding it to my chest as if I could press its words directly into my heart. Alexander was still asleep, the lines of his face smooth and peaceful in the morning glow. I saw him now through a new lens, a double exposure of the man I knew and the man he had revealed himself to be on these pages. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His stormy eyes, hazy with sleep, found mine and then dropped to the journal I held. A soft, almost shy smile touched his lips. "So you know all my secrets now," he murmured, his voice a low, sleep-roughened rumble that vibrated through me. I placed the journal carefully aside and moved into his arms, curling against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The heart that had once been a frozen, silent thing, now the drum to which my own life marched. "I always knew the most important one," I whispered, my lips against the warm skin of his throat. "I knew you were in there somewhere. I just had to wait for you to find your way out." He held me tighter, his hand a warm, heavy weight on my back. "You were the light, Amara. You lit the path out of the dark." We lay there as the sun climbed higher, painting the room in gold. There were no more words needed. The journal had said them all. The past was not just reconciled, it was integrated, a foundational layer upon which our present stood, unshakable and strong. The return to the mansion later that day felt like returning to a different home. The walls seemed to hum with a new energy, a deeper understanding. When Alexander walked into his study, he didn't glance at the space where Ilara's photograph had once been his only solace. Instead, his eyes found the new photographs that crowded his desk, the four of us laughing on the beach, Ilara in her graduation cap, Leo holding up a prize-winning science project. His past was not erased. It was simply the first chapter in a much longer, richer story. The following years were in many ways the sweetest. With the children forging their own paths, Alexander and I entered a new season of our marriage, a second honeymoon phase built not on discovery, but on deep, abiding knowledge. We had the time and the space to rediscover each other, not as parents or business partners, but simply as a man and a woman desperately in love. We took cooking classes in Tuscany, getting flour all over each other and laughing like teenagers. We went on a safari in Kenya, holding hands in the pre-dawn chill as a lion roared in the distance, feeling small and insignificant, and yet utterly connected to each other and the vast, wild world. We spent lazy Sunday mornings in bed with the newspapers, his feet tangled with mine, debating politics and planning our week. The foundation continued to be my passion, but now it felt like a shared legacy. Alexander's business acumen had streamlined its operations, turning it into a powerhouse of social change. We traveled together to open new chapters, and I watched him, the formidable Alexander Blackwood, kneel to talk to a young girl we had rescued from a forced marriage, his voice gentle as he asked her about her dreams. He saw Amara in every one of those girls, and he was determined to be the protector he had once failed to be for me. The cycles of life continued. Ilara graduated law school with honors, her fiery spirit channeled into a brilliant legal mind dedicated to human rights. She fell in love with a kind, steady man, a teacher who looked at her with the same awe I often saw in Alexander's eyes when he looked at me. The day she brought him home to meet us, Alexander took him into his study for a talk. I later learned it wasn't a threat, but a blessing. "Love her fiercely," Alexander had told the young man, his voice earnest. "And on the days it's hard, love her harder. She is her mother's daughter. She is worth any storm." Leo, our quiet observer, surprised us all by choosing a path of adventure. He joined a marine conservation organization, his work taking him to remote corners of the globe. We would get grainy satellite calls from the middle of the Pacific, his face sun-weathered and happy as he told us about the coral reefs he was helping to restore. Alexander, who had once built empires of steel and glass, now found his greatest pride in his son, the guardian of the natural world. The mansion, once a symbol of cold isolation, was now the bustling headquarters of our sprawling family. Christmases were chaotic, joyful affairs, filled with the sounds of Ilara's children, our grandchildren, racing through the halls, their laughter a beautiful echo of the silence that had once plagued these rooms. Alexander was a besotted grandfather, often found on the floor building elaborate block towers, his stern CEO persona completely abandoned for the joy of making a 2-year-old giggle. It was on one such Christmas Eve, the house filled with the scent of pine and baking cookies, the tree twinkling in the grand foyer, that I found myself standing alone for a moment in the doorway of the ballroom. I looked out at the scene, Ilara and her husband dancing, Leo showing his mother a video on his phone, Alexander with a sleeping grandchild nestled on his shoulder, his large. The dance in the doorway became one of those crystalline moments, suspended in amber in the gallery of my soul. The warmth of Alexander's hand on the small of my back, the scent of pine and his familiar sandalwood cologne, the muffled laughter of our family. It was a perfect, self-contained universe. When the song ended, he didn't let me go. He simply rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, breathing me in. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice a low vibration between us. He led me away from the festive noise, not towards the grand staircase, but down a quieter hall to a part of the mansion I rarely visited, a sunroom that faced the dormant winter garden. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight reflecting off the pristine snow outside. In the center of the room, on a small easel, was a canvas covered by a cloth. "I started this a long time ago," he said, his hand hovering near the cloth. "I could never finish it until now." With a gentle pull, he removed the cloth. I caught my breath. It was a painting of me, but not the me of now. It was the girl from the wedding night. I was depicted standing at the balcony of my old room in the mansion, the one he had given me that first night. My back was to the viewer, my silhouette framed by the cold, distant city lights. The wedding dress was exquisitely rendered, the silk and lace looking both magnificent and somehow like a cage. One hand was pressed against the glass and my head was bowed, the posture one of utter defeat. But the artist, Alexander, had not painted my reflection in the dark window. Instead, he had painted what was outside, but as if seen through my eyes. And there, in the midst of the cold, geometric city lights, he had imagined a single, impossibly bright star, its light a tiny, defiant pinprick in the overwhelming darkness. "I saw the star that night," he said softly, coming to stand beside me. "I looked at you, a silhouette of despair, and I saw that one stubborn point of light in the sky, and I thought, I don't know what I thought, it was just a feeling. A hope so faint I didn't recognize it as hope. I started this painting a week after our wedding in a fit of self-loathing and confusion. For years it was a reminder of my failure, of the pain I had caused. I could never finish your face. I could never give you an expression, because I didn't know what it should be." I stepped closer, my eyes tracing the delicate brushstrokes of the dress, the haunting loneliness of the scene. "And now," I whispered, "now I see that the star wasn't outside the window, Amara, it was inside the room." He turned me to face him. "You were the star. You were the light in the darkness, even when you were drowning in it. I just didn't have the eyes to see it." He gestured back to the painting. "It's finished now because I finally know the expression. It's not despair. It's fortitude. It's the quiet, stubborn strength of a star waiting for the dawn." Tears streamed down my face, silent and warm. This was his final apology, his ultimate understanding. He had not just given me his words in a journal. He had given me his art, his soul's interpretation of our beginning, reframed by the love that followed. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," I managed to say. "It's the truth," he replied simply. "Finally." That painting became our secret treasure. We hung it not in the public gallery of our home, but in his private study, where he could see it every day. A reminder of how far we had come, a tribute to the light we had found in each other. The years continued their graceful, relentless march. Our hair turned fully silver, the lines on our faces deepening into roadmaps of a life richly lived. Alexander slowly stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his empire, handing the reins to a younger, brilliant team he had mentored. His focus shifted entirely to the foundation, and most importantly to me. We became experts in the art of quiet companionship. Our adventures were smaller, more intimate. A drive along the coast to watch the winter storms roll in, a picnic in the wild rose garden that was now, under our decades of care, more magnificent than ever. We read the same books so we could debate them over long, wine-soaked dinners. We held hands under the table at restaurants like teenagers. The love did not fade. It deepened, becoming a sixth sense, an intrinsic part of our being. I could sense his mood from the way he stirred his coffee. He could anticipate a headache of mine before I felt the first throb and would have a cool cloth and aspirin waiting. We had built a language of glances, of touches, of shared silences that were more eloquent than any sonnet. When the first real test of our aging bodies came, it was for him. A minor heart scare that landed him in the hospital for observation for 2 nights. They were the longest nights of my life. The mansion, without his presence, reverted to its old, cold self. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was accusing. I slept in his study in the chair by the fire, wrapped in one of his old sweaters, the painting of the girl and the star my only comfort. He was fine. It was a warning, the doctor said, a reminder of mortality, but for us it was a lightning strike of clarity. Time was no longer an endless ocean, it was a precious, finite shore. When I brought him home, he was quieter for a few days. Then, one morning, he came to me as I was cutting roses for the dinner table. "No more putting things off," he declared, his voice firm. "That trip to see the northern lights, we're going, next month." And we did. We traveled to a remote lodge in Norway, and on a crystal-clear, freezing night, we stood wrapped in furs, our breath plumbing in the air, and watched the heavens dance. Ribbons of emerald and violet shimmered and pulsed across the star-strewn sky, a celestial ballet of unimaginable beauty. I felt small and insignificant, and yet, holding Alexander's hand, I also felt like the center of the universe. He didn't look at the lights for long. He turned and looked at me, his face illuminated by the otherworldly glow, his eyes reflecting the swirling galaxies above. "I have seen the most magnificent wonders this world has to offer," he said, his voice steady and clear in the Arctic silence. "But the greatest miracle I will ever witness is the love in your eyes when you look at me." We grew old together, and it was the privilege of my life. There were more scares, more slowdowns, more concessions to the passing years. But there was also an ever-deepening gratitude for every sunrise, every shared joke, every moment our eyes met across a room and communicated a lifetime of understanding. The final chapter of our story was not written with a dramatic ending, but with a slow, gentle fading, like the last note of a beautiful song. It was Alexander who went first. He left on a peaceful spring morning in our bed at the cottage, with the sound of the sea through the open window and my hand held tightly in his. There was no struggle, no pain. One moment he was sleeping, and the next he was simply elsewhere. His last conscious act had been to lift my hand to his lips and press a kiss to my knuckles. The grief was a physical thing, a vast, hollow ache that threatened to consume me. The world lost its color, its sound, its taste. For a time, I was that girl in the painting again, standing at the window, staring out at a world that had gone dark. But I was not that girl anymore. I had our children, our grandchildren. I had the foundation, which was his legacy as much as mine. And I had the unshakable certainty of 50 years of being profoundly, unconditionally loved. That kind of love does not vanish with a last breath. It becomes a part of you, a compass that continues to guide you long after the cartographer is gone. I moved back to the cottage permanently. It was where I felt closest to him. I could feel his presence in the salt-kissed air, in the worn grooves of the porch swing, in the wild, untamed beauty of the roses. One afternoon, a year after he had passed, I was in the garden with my granddaughter, a little girl with Alexander's stormy eyes and a fearless spirit. She was chasing a butterfly, her laughter like bells on the wind. She tripped and fell, a small scrape on her knee. I gathered her into my lap, soothing her as her tears subsided. "It's okay, my love," I whispered, rocking her. "The hurt will pass." She looked up at me, her big eyes serious. "Did Grandpa ever make your hurts pass, Grandma?" A smile touched my lips, fresh tears, but these were sweet, not bitter. "Oh, yes, my darling, he was the best at it. He taught me that the biggest hurts can become the most beautiful stories." I held her and looked out at the same sea he had sketched, the same sea we had sailed with Leo, the same sea that had witnessed the entirety of our epic. The cold, wealthy man had given me a world, but the man he became had given me himself. And that was the treasure that no amount of time or grief could ever diminish. The virgin forced to marry a cold, wealthy man had lived a life of legendary love. The man who left her in tears on their wedding night had spent a lifetime ensuring she knew only joy. And the story that began with a transaction ended with a truth that echoed into eternity. That love, true love, is the only force powerful enough to transform an ending into a forever. And in the quiet of my heart, I knew our story was not over. It was simply waiting for our next dance, under a sky full of stars.